All right, so this is the first lecture looking at imperialism. Um, and our intent here is to put forward a global picture of imperialism. And we do that to kind of set the stage for looking at independence movements. After this, we'll move on to looking at independence in British India and from French Algeria. And to do that, we will be looking at the origin and rise of independence movements, that is to say, why people wanted independence, and in what ways independence movements began to become popularized. Then we'll be looking at what methods people in India and Algeria used, and then that will be followed up with the first 10 years of independence, following independence, what things look like. So what we're looking at now this week is setting the stage for this comparative approach that we'll be taking as we go forward. And this again is the intent. Before we can explore independence movements, we should learn about the world they're trying to break away from. So colonization has created the world we live in. I'd like to suggest to you that it's perhaps the most, if not one of the most, important events of the last 500 years, and certainly the last 200. So some ways in which colonial rule has shaped the world we live in are these. ISIS, or Daesh, or the so-called Islamic State, came to rise a few years back in what's now Iraq and Syria, with the intent of in Lebanon, with the intent of rejecting borders created by the British and French. There's this notion of international law and human rights, but is that an imposition of Western values as universal? We have call centers in India that speak English. We have military dictators in Africa, white populations in Australia, national borders that don't align with local ethnicities, cultures, and patterns of rule. The fact that people in Mexico speak Spanish and those in Brazil speak Portuguese. Our wars in Iraq. And of course, the fact that your teacher is of Indian ancestry, teaching you in the English language on the ancestral lands of the Tualatin Kalapuya. Our very existence at Southridge and in this class is a direct result of imperialism in India and settler colonialism in what is now the United States. So imperialism and colonial rule. This is just, as I said, one way to view how the past has shaped the present. And to set us up, we're just going to look at three definitions here to start. Empire. What is meant by empire? Empire is composed of previously separate units. Empire is diverse, ethnically, culturally, linguistically, religiously. So, for example, if you are the king or queen of X or Y place, but it's not an empire, the people whom you rule are broadly or likely to be more ethnically, culturally, linguistically similar. But that's not the case with empires, which tend to stretch over a broad geographic space. But this is not a diversity of equals. The language that scholars use and that we'll use in this class is core and periphery. So what is a core? The core is the seat of the empire. So for the Roman Empire, that would be Rome. For the British Empire, the core is Britain and London in particular. So the core is the seat of the empire, and the periphery is all that is around, all that it has conquered and controls. And we'll also be looking at direct and indirect rule, which are two different systems of governance and rule in an empire. And so we'll be coming to those in the coming lectures. Here's another definition for you, and it's of imperialism. So let's take a moment to read it, and then we'll unpack it. All right. So the idea here is imperialism is a process. It's a process. It is, pardon, it is not a thing that is static. It's imperializing. To have an empire is to continually imperialize in a present sense, in a continuous sense. So imperialism is a process whereby the dominant politico-economic interest of one nation, so the political and economic desires of one country, expropriate, that is to say, take. So think of it as taking or stealing or something like that. Expropriate for their own enrichment the land, labor, raw materials, and markets of another people. So within this definition of imperialism, we have a few points. One, as a reminder, it's a process. It's an active process. It's where the political and economic interest of one country or nation take for the benefit their land, labor, raw materials, and markets of another people. So what do we mean by land? I think that's pretty clear. Labor, we're talking about the ability to work, if you will, of the people who are in that colony. Raw materials, things that unprocessed stuffs. So that can be minerals, can be raw materials, also agricultural goods, also animals, for example, are all considered raw materials. Now, markets means that the economy, the local economy in the colonized state, in the imperialized state, is for the benefit of the other country. So if we were to take the example of India, the textile markets in India, the clothing markets in India, are structured to benefit Britain, not to benefit Indians. The agricultural markets of India are set up to benefit London, not India. Okay. I would encourage you, if you haven't already, to write this down and to clarify it in words that make sense to you. Our last definition is colonialism. Colonialism is a kind of imperialism, and it's really the kind of imperialism that we're going to be focused on here for this class. And very simply, it is the policy or practice of acquiring full or partial political control over another country, occupying it with settlers, and exploiting it economically. So very similar to imperialism, one of the key distinctions is the occupation with settlers. And we'll come to settler colonies later on, but the idea with this framing of settlers is settlers can be people who work for the colony. So they may not be necessarily moving and setting up cities and towns and villages and agricultural centers, but they are maybe taking part of a town. So the distinction I want to make here when we get to settler colonies is you have some places like India where many thousands of British people came to work and maybe spent some decades there, but the goal wasn't to live in India permanently, and that's distinct from, say, for instance, true settler colonies like we'll see in Algeria and South Africa, but also the United States, Canada, Australia,